political scientists who have observed politics in post-Soviet space for years, who studied Russian and Belarusian societies and political systems. And this war came for me completely unexpected. And I am not the only one to have been mistaken in this way, because most of my friends and colleagues who study Russia and more general who work in post-Soviet space, all of us, we all have been certain before the war that it would not happen. Yet it is here. So from the beginning of the war, I started to reflect on this situation because it was important also, you know, even psychologically somewhere. I started to reflect on this situation to try to understand the reasons behind it. If we look at that rationally, there was no immediate threat to Russia from Ukraine or from the West. The reasons of fighting Nazis in Ukraine and that Ukraine was involved in genocide against Russian-speaking population, which are put forward by Russian propaganda, they do not make any sense either. From the foreign relations perspective, it may seem that the actions of Russian decision makers do not make any sense at all. Not only Russia engaged in a war that is illegal, because there were no consultations with the UN Security Council, there were no consultations with international partners, then not only the Russian economy will be devastated by the sanctions which were introduced as a result, not only will it be next to impossible to re-establish friendly relations with Ukraine and Central European countries in future, not only Russia is to become a rogue state, expelled already from many international events and some international organizations, as the Council of Europe, where Russia was expelled from, but even from the military point of view, Russian forces do not seem to win this war. So the only rational answers I find for the questions I asked myself about this war, I find not in the dimension of foreign policy, but rather on an internal scale, specifically analyzing political regimes, and especially Russian political regime. I do not want to say that geopolitical tensions, security considerations, or ideological imperialism are not involved, but I do not think that these considerations suffice to explain the situation. I don't think it's enough to explain what is happening. And I want to stress that the separation between external and internal policies is mostly theoretical, by the way, because from the social sciences perspective, people do not act international or domestic. Those are not different types of attitude, not different types of actions. They just act socially. And these actions are partly determined by the structure, social relations, structure of opportunities that they see, and the context. So, I mean, they don't separate external from domestic. It's something. Those are two dimensions of the same process of political actions. And so, from this is something which may appear quite obvious, but it is still important to remember because very often the actual reasons for an external policy measures can be found on the plane of internal politics, and not only on this opposition between big powers, superpowers, and geopolitical interests and issues. We should really analyze what's happening inside those different countries. And again, I do not want to say that the perspective I will speak about today is the only possible to analyze the war in Ukraine. It only draws our attention to a part of reality. Of course, the whole reality is much bigger. There may be different considerations. But this political regime prism allows to highlight some elements which are sometimes misread or, let's say, left without due attention. And perhaps it is part of professional deformation from my side, on my behalf, but bear with me today, and I will try to show you how the study of political regimes helps answer many questions about this war, questions which are difficult, at least for me, to answer rationally otherwise. So let's start with the concept of political regime per se. So in the constitutional, let's say, dimension, The political regimes are basically the constitutional forms of organization of the state. You know, all these binary differences between a federal state or unitary state, monarchy, republic, parliamentary and presidential regime. So those are basically the constitutional principles of the organization of relations between different political organs. But this is not of particular interest for us today, this constitutional dimension, because, well, this is very easy. Russia is, super presidential, at least federal republic. But what interests here particularly is the political aspect of the classification of the study of political. It means how the state functions in reality, how the state effectively operates. So the broad definition of political regimes or political systems, it's more or less the same from this political science perspective, is that political regime is a system of state administration of social life. Basically, it's the system through which the state intervenes in social life and manages social life. So the political regimes from this point of view describe relations between state and society, how state operates with society, which are interactions, relations, what are the modes of communication, responsibility, and so on. State, also the relations between state and individuals. What is the role of individual in the state? How state respects or not the rights and the of the individual, and also the relations inside the state apparatus, relations between different bodies, organs, mechanisms, institutions inside the state. And when we speak about political regimes in this sense, the relations between the ruling elite and opposition or dissidents are particularly important because they underline the nature of these political regimes and also are very important guarantees for the respect of the rules of the political game. Means the questions of rule of law and human rights. So in this sense, in traditional literature, three types of political regimes are most often evoked, which are classically totalitarianism, democracy, and authoritarian. So let's start with totalitarianism. Sometimes in media debate or in public debate, Russia is called a totalitarian state. Well, it's not, from the point of view of political science, it's not an adequate definition. Totalitarianisms are very rare. Those are the regimes which are governed by ideology, very, let's say, omnipresent, ubiquitous ideology with a not less ubiquitous party-state system. There is one major party which controls all the state apparatus, the totality of the state. There is no place for private life, at least public. There is no individualism. So the principle of totalitarian regimes is the unity of the society. So it's a very monolithic regime based on total control and on a totalitarian ideology. And it has been widely recognized that only several modern states, very intense dictatorship, qualify as totalitarianisms. Namely and fully, those are Nazi Germany and Soviet Union under Stalin's rule. Only the period of Stalin's rule in 30s, 40s, 50s can be qualified, early 50s, before the death of Stalin, can be qualified as totalitarian. There are debates on other cases. For instance, fascist Italy. Some say, well, it has some elements of totalitarianism. Khmer Rouge dictatorship in Cambodia. China during the Cultural Revolution era. Perhaps North Korea today, or post-Soviet Turkmenistan. So there are several countries where there are still debates on, can we call them totalitarian states, or is it not entirely appropriate? But today's Russia or Belarus for sure do not fall into the category. They do not possess the present state party apparatus. They don't really have a totalitarian ideology. The level of repression, even when it's quite high during the very intense periods, still has nothing to do with Nazi Germany. So let's say that today's Russia or Belarus do not qualify as totalitarian. Then there is a couple which follows totalitarianism, which is a couple of democracy authoritarianism, where things are not simple either. Yes, authoritarianism is most often seen as a political system somewhere along the line between democracy and totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is the harshest form of dictatorship. Democracy is relatively free political regime, and authoritarianism is somewhere between them. And since it is widely recognized that totalitarianism are almost extinct today, authoritarian regimes are in fact opposed to democracies, both in academic and non-academic debate by them. And so autocracy, authoritarianism, has become a synonym of a non-democratic regime. But there have been many attempts also to define authoritarianism formally, in particular, in order to trace the line between, the imperfect democracies and mild authoritarianism. Authoritarianisms are the systems where you still have some political pluralism, which is limited. When there's no totalitarian guiding elaborate ideology, where one does not govern through intensive or extensive political mobilization, that in authoritarian regimes, well, the citizens, most often, they tend to be depoliticized. And where the limits of the power are not well defined. That means that there's much less limits to their, much less checks on the governing elites. One of my preferred definitions of authoritarianism is the definition of a French political scientist, Yauheni, who presents authoritarianism as a generic term, referring to a large spectrum of political situations where, and I quote, state powers are concentrated in the hands of individuals or groups whose main aim is to withdraw their political fate from the hazards of competition that they would not control entirely. The main objective of authoritarian regimes is to minimize the risks of losing power. There may be some form of simulacra of political process, even elections, but they won't be fair because in the authoritarian regime, the outcome of the elections can always be predicted very clearly because the elections cannot serve to change the power. So the essence of authoritarianism, whatever it is, whatever type of authoritarianism it might be, I think is the tendency to monopolize political power. Here it is a pretension and aspiration to control only political competition. In democracy, political pluralism is essential, and there is a room and a role to play for opposition, dissidents, and so on. So democracy, theoretically at least, welcomes political competition and pluralism, not tries to monopolize political power and exclude, the competitor. So monopolization of power, once again, it's a very general term, right? So what monopolization of power stands for concretely? For me, it is the sum of three components. First component, no regular change of power. Second component, no limits for the power. And third is the monopoly of political representation. Let's see those in more detail. So first, no possibility or regular change of power. In French, we have a very good term to describe the change of power through regular procedures, which is called alternance politique. Democratic regimes are designed to guarantee regular and systematic rotation of political forces who assume government. And so change of power in democracy is not a tragedy, it's a usual thing, and it is something which is needed to keep the system healthy. On the other hand, authoritarian regimes are designed not to guarantee rotation, but on the contrary, authoritarian regimes are designed to reproduce power. In democracy, also in some democracies, the same person or the same party can remain in power for many decades. In Japan, after the Second World War, or like in Germany before the last elections. But the real difference is that in democracy, the changeover of political power through elections on a very regular, normal basis is always possible. You cannot predict the outcome of the elections. Second, authoritarian regimes, no clear limits are imposed on power holders. So these limits exist, of course. Everything is not possible, but these limits are ill-defined and extensible. They change according to the situation, according to the needs of the ruling elites. Legal and constitutional limits are abusively misinterpreted or modified. In democracies, we have two strong instruments to limit political power. First, it is the rule of law. The limits of competences of power are very clear, need to be very clear. The second instrument to limit political power in democracies is the separation of separation of powers, also known as the system of checks and balances. It is important to have several centers of power, several institutions. They can block each other if one goes too far. And there are two types of separation of power: vertical, between different levels of power, central, regional, local, federal, subfederal, etc., and horizontal separation of power, classically executive, legislative, judicial, and three branches which are independent one from each other. And the independence of judiciary is particularly important. Democracy is also designed to avoid power. For authoritarianism, the abuse of power is its very essence. It's the logic of its operation. And the third component of monopolization of power is the monopoly of representation. In an authoritarian regime, a dictator and a group of people from ruling circles pretend to be the only true representative of the society as a whole. All the others, pretenders, are considered marginal or false or puppets of political groups or social groups or economic groups or agents of foreign influence, etc. So as a result, in authoritarianism, the real political opposition struggles to survive, most often outside of state institutions, outside of parliament. Dissidence is unaccepted in the areas where it can become influential, like in state institutions, in large media, etc. The organized civil society initiatives are restricted, influential media are controlled, and critical media are targeted. All of it is done to say that the only real representative of the society are the leaders of the regime. In democracies, the complexity of society, its difference, its heterogeneity are recognized and accepted. It is the basis for healthy pluralism. Authoritarian regimes, on the contrary, tend to simplify and oversimplify social structure and political debates. There is a very strong polarization between us and them, marginal forces who are not supported in the country and serve as a tool of foreign states. So these three aspects, no political change, unchecked political power, and monopolistic political representation, are, to my opinion, three components of the tendency to monopolize power, which is the main difference between authoritarian and democratic. It pains me to say that according to these and other definitions of political regimes, Russia is an authoritarian state. Most specialists today consider that Russian political regime took an authoritarian turn around 2011-2012. During this winter, 2011-2012, there were large protest rallies against electoral fraud. In 2011, decided to come back to president's seat after having switched with Dmitry Medvedev for prime minister. And then the protests were severely repressed, with many protesters sentenced to prison terms. Elections were rigged after that as well. Opposition repressed too, including political assassination. And it is also during this period of 2011-2012, let's say, that the Pussy Riot trial took place. Perhaps you remember it was a trial against a feminist punk band, an anti-Putin song in the Christ the Savior Cathedral. Then they filmed it and put it online, and then they were arrested. And the obviously extreme and disproportionate sentence for music performance in a cathedral was clearly an indication that no radical criticism would be tolerated hereafter. So in 2012, already it became quite clear that Russia was moving towards a real authoritarian system. Some observers find early signs of the authoritarian turn in early 2000s, when Vladimir Putin came to power and started to take in hand Russian political and economic circles. First, there were conflicts between new political ruling elites and several businessmen that we were called oligarchs at this time, so large businessmen. There was a takeover of the media by circles close to new President Putin, including the then independent and popular TV channel NTV, which was a big independent TV channel, which was then taken over by circles close to the authorities. But it is about 10 years later that it became clear that Russia moves in an authoritarian direction. Since Putin came to power, two state bodies, two organizations or institutions became drastically more powerful. First, it is the presidential administration, which is in Russia separate from the government. Unlike in the United States, where the president is the head of government at the same time, in Russia, there is a prime minister who is appointed by the parliament theoretically. It was supposed to be a kind of secretariat for the president, but it progressively became really a major decision-making center. Most decisions in foreign policy are first prepared in the presidential administration, and then they go to the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. The second institution is the Federal Security Service, FSB. It's an heir of KGB, and it's new, say, reincarnation of KGB, which is a secret service, and which gained a lot of power starting from 2000, when many control functions were transferred to this agency in economic, foreign, security, and other areas. And this is not a coincidence and not a banal fact. Coming back to the issue of ruling elites and not institutions, which is not the same, there are several types of elites who influence politics. In 1990s Russia, for instance, there were more or less four large groups of political elites in a nutshell. There were so-called reformists, who were progressive parts of former Soviet nomenclatura, like political administrative elites, but those were the most progressive parts of former Soviet. Then you had oligarchs, new large business circle. You had communist conservatives, and you had what is called in Russian siloviki, who are representatives of military, police, and secret service. Putin's coming to power was a trend of strengthening of elites coming from KGB and FSB, from Secret Service. Putin himself is a former KGB officer who was head of FSB. This book shows how, starting from 2000s, we see in Russia strengthening of actual or former officers of secret services. So what we have in Russia, there is not only an authoritarian state, but an authoritarian state with domination of secret service. And the stakes are enormous in Russia, because in this corrupt system, those who control political power also control profits from natural resources, harvesting and trade, including oil and gas, which are, as you know, quite strategic resources today. It is true, as I said in the introduction, it is hard to find rational explanation purely from external policy point of view. Now, I think the reason is that Russian elites' main objective is to reproduce their domination, reproduce their rule. Russia has the GDP of Spain. The economic modernization did not go well in Russia. Its wealth still comes from natural resources. In addition, more wealth would bring about more autonomy from non-state business. Russian authorities also cannot offer a clear and appealing ideology that would compensate lack of economic success. In the USSR, there was an idea of a new, fair society. Today, the situation is different. Russia is a country without clear, distinctive ideology. Well, I mean, they do have some elements which they reproduce, like homophobia, hate of migrants, and Orthodox religion, but those are not enough. So we have a situation where a dictator is getting old. So let us imagine the hypothesis that the conflicts where Russia takes regularly part since 2000s, Chechen War, war Georgia, Syrian conflict, annexation of Crimea, and war in eastern Ukraine, and full-scale war in Ukraine. Let us imagine those conflicts are kind of a reset that reproduce Russian political regime canceling political discontent. The first advantage is that it allows for a military scenography in which the authorities and Putin can play a role of protector. The second advantage is that it invalidates internal criticism in Russia, consolidates the state system to avoid dissidents in the state institutions, and it also allows for further repressions of the opposition and of the independent media, who can be accused of betrayal during the wartime. And let us not forget that less than 2 years ago, there were very massive protests in Belarus, several months ago in Kazakhstan, and it must have certainly warned Russian authorities, because Russia could have been the next dictatorship where massive protests could have taken place, endangering the reproduction of political regime. So let us consider a following hypothesis. In order to reproduce itself, Russian authoritarian political regime controlled by corrupt elites with a strong secret service element needs war, or at least benefits from war, uses the war. The second question we should ask, and we can try to answer, is why. If you look at the very recent history of Ukraine, you will see that Ukraine is a country where there was twice a power change through mass protests recently. First, in 2004, 2005, when people protested against what they considered fraud and managed to force the authorities to organize new elections where opposition candidates. And second, 2014, when again people came to the streets to protest against corrupt oligarchic power and managed to chase their pro-Russian president away. And then they elected two different presidents consequently from two different parties. And the pluralism is like blooming there. And for Russian power elites, it should ring a bell, and it does not sound good for them. So if you add that a lot of Russians have friends and family in Ukraine, and they were connected to this society, it is possible to change the corrupt system, to bring about new leaders, new people, that the changeover of power is usually a beneficial thing. And this is something Russian authorities would like to avoid. Another question often asked today is Putin demented? I mean, is it not the reason of the war? Maybe it's about his mental health. I think that it is not even the issue. And not only because I'm against personification of politics, and I truly believe that politics is always a collective endeavor. But let's imagine Putin is really a demented, mentally insane person who believes everything he says. It is exactly for such situation that modern democratic institutions were invented. Democracy is not only a beautiful idea of power to the people and such. Modern democratic regime is first of all about safeguards against idiots, bandits, and insane. So the last question I would like to go very, very briefly is why Russians allow this, because there is sometimes criticism toward Russian citizens who do not rebel against Russian authorities and do not just stop them in this war. Well, first, it is not entirely true, but the fact that these protests are not as massive as we would like them to be can be explained by two main mechanisms, I think: propaganda and repression. First, the media in Russia are much polarized, and most major media, especially the TV, are controlled by the authorities. And state-controlled media continue to broadcast propaganda according to which Russian army is about to free Ukraine. Yes, in many cases, people seem to believe rather Russian media than their own friends and family in Ukraine. And it's sad, but it's the fact. At the same time, independent media critical of authorities are censored and repressed. And I really feel sorry for these people. And I already felt that when I last time to Russia in 2016 to make interviews about censorship. And I was speaking, with people who are very critical of the authorities, who understand that this regime moves to a completely barbarian direction, and they cannot do anything because they're considered as traitors in the country, and it should be really hard for them to leave this situation. So we should not interpret lack of massive protests as a sign of support Actually, this very war was needed, I think, for and not only this war, but other conflicts as well, were a tool for the Russian regime to avoid the rebellion inside the country. So I don't think in short term, I don't think so. Long term, it's a different thing because if you look to history, well, Afghanistan, for instance, was also planned as swift operation, and at the beginning there were no much protests and so on. But in 6, 7 years, it became one of the main reasons why the Soviet Union crashed. But not only because of the internal opposition, but because of the sanctions. I think what can be expected is that the sanctions make the life in Russia unbearable for people and for part of the elite. And then one could expect some kind of coup or really rebellion. But I mean, it's really hard. It's really hard to predict things now. But if we speak about the end of the operation in Ukraine, I would count here even more on foreign pressure, because I think that today sanctions, Western sanctions, they really harm the Russian regime more than internal problems. Here there is this element that, I mean, the sanctions are not less effective than their absence, and the sanctions are not only to change the policy of a state against which it is applied. It is also a statement. It is a statement of international community, of Western community, saying, well, no, it shouldn't work like that. We do not agree. We will not, invest in a country which wields war. We will not trade with the country which wields war. So it's not for Russian citizens that it is done, first and foremost. It is for the citizens of the country who introduced sanctions, because the politicians in France, in the European Union, in the Soviet, in the United States, they're accountable to their citizens, and their citizens expect them to make a statement when they see such horror going on. So the sanctions are not only to be considered from the point of view of the efficiency, to my opinion, but also from the point of view of making a statement, because otherwise it is impossible. Direct military action, I don't believe it. The position of most Western leaders of NATO countries is quite clear about that. Is that direct military engagement with Russia means Third World War. And the Third World War might be nuclear. And I mean, it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help anybody. Other tools, to contribute, to take part in it, to support Ukraine, send weapons, find financial aid, humanitarian aid, accept refugees, really a lot of other tools. The military are available to support Ukraine. It was a neutral country. It used to be a neutral country for all these years with some kind of there were signed the treaties about cooperation between Russia and Ukraine, recognizing the borders and all. So, I mean, Ukraine used to be a neutral country because before the annexation of Crimea, before the war in Donbass, and then before this war. So, I mean, as opposed to Baltic states, from the very beginning, of their independence, just went straight west, and then they joined NATO as fast as they could. Retrospectively, I must admit that they were right. And because now they are protected, at least, because Ukraine chose another way. They said, yeah, let's be neutral, let's be between those two and try to to trade. We don't have to go into this new Cold War paradigm and all. But and look what happened. And I'm really sorry to say that, because I don't believe it's a good idea to form big military alliances that are opposed. I'm against the Cold War, but I mean, being intellectually honest with myself, well, I have to admit it. And let's look at Finland now. Now they're seriously discussing the possibility of joining NATO. The very Finnish model might become part of NATO, and Sweden as well. So I mean, the very actions of Russian authorities and of Russian regime, they kind of turn you away from neutrality, and they say, and the Ukrainian politicians and Ukrainian people also, I don't know how you sell it to them, because they'll say, but it was already the case. How many years more before, Russia would try something else? Here the probability is high. I wouldn't be surprised if Putin stays like for 10 years more. Look at the Soviet Union.